This is Conspirinormal.
All right, guys, welcome back to Conspirinormal.
Back in the basement.
Yeah, back in the basement for the second time this month. It's amazing. Yeah, we're back in the basement, like all good podcasters, right?
At least it's not my mom's, you know. At least it's mine.
Right. So you guys can hear we have a guest on the line. We've got somebody that we haven't had on for like 2 years, and that's Walter Bosley. Walter, welcome back to Conspirinormal, man. It's been forever. I was looking at it yesterday to try to find out when the last time I had you on, and we had you on sometime in the summer of 2019 talking about esoteric Napoleon.
Yes, and yeah, it has been 2020. Just for my reasons, and everybody, I think everybody the same thing. 2020 now is just this weird blur that happened. It seemed like real quick, even though it didn't feel like it was real quick.
Yeah.
We were all going through it, but yeah, it's easy to forget that big 12-month period, boom, is right in there in the middle of things. So it's great to be back. Thanks for having me back, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. It was a hell of a year for us too, but understand that for you it was quite a year. And part of the reason why we haven't talked to you in a while. But we're glad that you're doing well.
Oh, thank you. I had to just kind of withdraw for a while and take care of the medical issue there, the cancer, and that worked, and it's all good. And I'm glad to be back in the action again.
Yeah, as you say, we're glad that you're there to give the UFO people problems. So can't leave us yet, Bosley.
I'm going to be speaking at Contact in the Desert this year because, despite what some folks think, I'm a believer in them flying saucers, and I've seen a UFO, and I think ETs are real, and I'm very very glad to be asked again. It was canceled last year, of course, and was asked to return, and I'm looking forward to that. So I do enjoy the topic. I do enjoy it.
Yeah, absolutely. Same here, even though it does get crazy at times.
Sure.
For obvious reasons. Well, I hear that what's the latest thing? I heard that the Tom DeLonge's group is no more, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard
the same thing. Yeah.
That's not happening anymore. Honestly, to tell you the truth, with everything that was going on in 2020, I really didn't pay much attention to the UFO world.
How did you survive?
I don't think a lot of people did. I think people had their minds on various other things besides the two big ones, and I think with what was going on politically and with the COVID thing, that seems to have really come to the forefront and taken over the alternative research, discussion, right? Because everybody was trying to figure out exactly what was going on. Was this a conspiracy? Was that So UFOs, you're right. UFOs took a big backseat. It was kind of interesting. Kind of gave everyone a breather.
I think when they were doing not this stimulus, but the one in between, the $600 one, I think that there was some discussion about funding for UFO research. And that was a big thing all over UFO Twitter. And I was just kind of like, okay.
Wait a minute. Were they saying that that's why our stimulus was lower?
No, I don't think it had anything to do with that.
Okay, I wouldn't put it past them to come up with a theory like that.
Right. But it was something that was in the bill, apparently, out of all the other things that were in the bill.
Oh, that's right.
This was the disclosure is coming now crowd, and
always.
And of course, yeah. Disclosure is always right around the bend, right?
Weren't we laughing about this and saying it wasn't going to happen the last time we talked, and the time before that, and the time before that?
Yes.
And yet when you do, you get thumbs down, you get these people that they get all angry and frustrated, and yet here we are, yet another year or so has passed, and we still don't have that disclosure year after year.
Well, it's funny, Walter. I always liken it to the kind of like evangelical apocalypse crowd.
Mm.
That it just always seems like it's right around the bend. It's always coming. You always have to revise the date. It's 2015, it's 2020, oh, it's 2025.
Yeah,
Well, that's
Jesus
been
is
every
coming,
year
and he's
since-
riding
No,
a
it's
UFO.
2025.
Well, that's
It's-
been every year since.
Right, exactly. So you are working on another book right now.
Yes, I am. I'm
And-
continuing a book that I had to stop working on in the middle of, for obvious reasons, last year, and I'm working on getting that one finished, so I can go on to the next one.
Yeah, and that's you're coming out with the 5th Secret Missions book.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about, because like 'cause it's been so long since we've had you on. There may be some people in the audience that are not familiar with you. Let's talk a little bit about like these Secret Missions books and like what you talk about in these books. And if anybody is also interested, you can find where I've pretty much have interviewed Walter, like just about every book that you've written, Walter. I think we've done an interview on. So you guys can go back in the archives. If you want more description of what's going on in these books, you can. But
Well, basically, the Secret Missions books started out as a one-off. It was just a book that I had just finished the Empire of the Wheel trilogy, and that was a very intense 7 years of my life as far as that, the research and the strange synchronicity and just all the weird stuff that went on during the time that I was researching those books. And I wanted to do something. I just wanted to work on something that was completely different. So I had been gathering and collecting, stumbling upon, you might say, information about Juan Cabrillo, the Portuguese explorer who, for Spain, was commissioned by Spain to explore what's called Alta, or Upper California, which is today the state of California, the United States. And he's credited with being the first European to lead an expedition to, do an exploration on what we call California today. And I thought it was just going to be the one book. And basically the premise is you have a historical figure, this famous explorer Juan Cabrillo, and you have some interesting little connections. For instance, the Templar connection, and that led to the potential Joan of Arc connection, specifically her sword, and just this really interesting mix. And and there's California in the middle of it. And so I did this book, and after I finished it, right after I finished it, I thought, well, I ought to consider some other figures, maybe do another one of these. And I happen to have been reading about Sir Richard Francis Burton, a particular thing about one of the books he'd written. And I learned something I didn't know, because I've been a fan of Burton for a long time at that point, several years. And I had learned that when he went to South America, there was a period of 4.5 months where he was missing. And nobody knows to this day exactly where he was. And what's weird is there's not a word written about it in any of his journals or his own writings. Now, Burton was a man who wrote profusely about everything he did, every expedition, everything. And for there to be a 4.5-month gap in his writings, that was highly suspicious to me. And then when I saw that he was in the middle of the South American wilderness during this time, and nobody knew exactly what he was doing, well, wow, right there, that was screaming for me to look at and dig into. So I did. I spent 5 months. My full-time job, 7 days a week, was just reading. I consulted over 90 books. I read. I drew from, or I think I read 50 or 60 books in that process, cover to cover. and consulted, an additional 20 some, just an enormous amount of material. I think there's 70 something books in the bibliography, but I spent, 4 or 5 months just doing pure research, taking notes, and then I jumped into writing the book. And it's one of the books I'm most proud of, to be honest, the Secret Missions to Lost Expedition of Sir Richard Francis Burton. I'm very proud of that book because I did a lot of work on it, a lot of scholarly work, and I think it has some of my best ideas and proposals. So as I was researching that book, though, before I wrote it, I stumbled upon a theory about Ambrose Bierce, another guy who I've admired, but I didn't know as much about as I knew about Burton. And it was such an interesting story, and it had to do with the infamous crystal skull, stuff, and which is a mixed bag. And I set aside what I had read about Bierce and the crystal skull. I finished the Burton book, and then I went back to the Bierce material and realized, oh, wow, okay, I've got to dig into this, and this is definitely worthy of a book, because Ambrose Bierce is probably just as famous for having completely disappeared after riding into Mexico on horseback in 1913. And he just disappeared. Nobody ever had contact with him after one last letter that had been written, and nobody's ever found his remains. It's a big, huge mystery. But I realized, well, I've got another book in this series, and so by that time I realized, wow, 3 books. I think I've got a series concept here. And I had been interested in Napoleon because of some curious things about the Louisiana Purchase, and of course the legendary tale that he had spent a night in the pyramid and had a weird experience. So I thought, I've been wanting to dig into the Louisiana Purchase, but really I need to just dig into Napoleon. And so I was thinking about it. I went and visited a buddy of mine in the Midwest, and in a used bookstore, I found a copy of a book from the 1940s, I think, titled Bonaparte in Egypt.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I had heard of this book, but I scooped it up, I read it, and once I read that, I realized, oh my God, this is the next one. So I got into that, and I realized I can't fit all there is to say about Napoleon from this perspective in the one volume. So I decided, okay, this has got to be a second volume. And so I'm 4 books into this series, a series concept, which I have to admit, I just love. It's one of my favorite things I've come up with, to be honest. And that's from the perspective of being a writer and a researcher. I enjoy looking into this stuff. I enjoy writing about this stuff because exploration and adventure, they're 2 of my favorite things, to read about and study and such. And I finally decided that I needed to fill some gaps, because these figures, they're all, and this is the concept of the series. You take one of these legendary explorers or an individual like Ambrose Bierce, Napoleon, and what they have in common is they are all men who seemed, just from the outset, when you read about their lives, they seem to have had some private interests in not so private, in ancient history and things like that, but a deep interest in things like lost civilizations. And it appears that when you look at the events and the activities of their lives, that they were all looking for the evidence of the traces of these lost civilizations.
Hence the secret mission.
Yeah, and thus the secret mission, because they either kept it to themselves, a private agenda, or to some degree, they were actually sent to look at these things. As in the case of Burton, I believe, I think he was doing some of what I suspect on behalf of British intelligence, for example. But he was personally deeply interested in this. And that's really what the series is about, until you get to this new one, the 5th book. And that's where I'm trying to fill in the gaps to give the reader a chronological context, because I didn't write them in historical order. But I want the reader to be able to go back and say, okay, here's the context of, from Cabrillo to Napoleon to Burton to Bierce. the context they were living in. Here's the things that were going on along the lines of what's in the book between, their times on the stage. And that's what number 5 is about, but also answers some unanswered questions about some of these individuals.
And so unlike the other ones, it's not going to be based on a particular person. Right.
It answers, I think I know what happened to Cabrillo and where he ended up, and I go into that.
Okay.
I go into the very interesting character I may have talked about. I think, I might have talked about him with you guys. Jan Pataki, the author of a manuscript found in Saragossa, which is a book and a film from that, a Polish film from 1965. But the book was written in the early 19th century. Pataki was of the Napoleonic era. Fascinating figure. I go into him a bit in this book, and like I said, I just kind of fill in the historical context. But the big old fat part, I'm still in the middle of finishing it, is that there seems to me to be some ancient mystery in California that I think the Templars became aware of after the Fourth Crusade. I think Juan Cabrillo was aware of. I think Sir Francis Drake was aware of it. And I have this particular hypothesis about California from that perspective, but also what certain factions were, in my opinion, they were struggling over control of California, dating back to, the Templar times on up to the present. And so I'm trying to lay that out in this book, that basic idea. And so it's kind of a sprawling, it also talks about the common threads that run through all the Secret Missions books and all my other books as well. So it's this big sprawling, kind of, I wouldn't call it encyclopedic, but it's kind of a necessary volume because it just fills in some gaps and gives a little more information that based on research I've done since I wrote those first 4.
I really enjoyed all the books. I don't remember you. I really don't remember you talking about Juan Pataki, though. I don't remember that part. Well, do you think that there were Templars in the United States in what later became the United States?
Oh yeah. I think they started coming over here, during the Henry Sinclair times. I'm a proponent of the theory, and it's not original with me, but during that Fourth Crusade, when instead of going on to the Middle East, they decided to sack Constantinople.
Right.
And at that time, the theory is that they captured, seized documentations and ancient charts, documents, manuscripts, ancient charts and maps and portolans, as they call them in some cases, from the imperial archives. And these were a lot of documents and charts that had been in the Library of Alexandria prior to that. And in these documents, of course, was information and maps and charts about what went on to be called the New World, the Americas, at a time when, according to our history books, Europeans, and so that suggests that, of course, you've heard the theory that the Templars were doing secret expeditions over here to the Americas for a couple of hundred years before Columbus. Definitely awareness, and probably 150 years period of time before the 1492 expedition. Some even suspect that Columbus actually made a clandestine trip here first in 1485. And I do definitely think that the Templars and others, but definitely the Templars made it to America based on these secret maps and charts before Columbus.
And beyond just the existence of the landmass over here, you think there was other knowledge that they're privy to, knowledge that later led a lot of these figures that you have written the series about to look for things in particular in the Americas.
Yes, yeah, especially where San Francisco Bay is concerned. We are told, get this, we're told that the Juan Cabrillo expedition, led by Cabrillo, we're told that a man who scared the hell out of his crews because he was sailing tight against the coastal line. This is north of Santa Barbara and just south of San Francisco Bay, where there's cliffs. If you've ever been down the PCH, the Pacific Coast Highway, you'll know what I'm talking about. But this is a man who would hug the coastline so closely that he was scaring the hell out of his crews because they thought he's going to crash the ships into this cliff. And we're told that they sailed right past the mouth of San Francisco Bay, but found the mouth of the Russian River and stopped there. And then they didn't miss San Francisco Bay once. Oh no, we're told that Cabrillo missed it twice because coming back down, hugging the shore, he misses the San Francisco Bay again. Well, I don't buy that for a minute. I think he indeed, if you've ever been to San Francisco, been out here to the Bay Area, that's a pretty big enough gap, okay, of open seawater to miss when you're looking for. Remember, they're always looking for the Northwest Passage, okay, all of these expeditions, which means when you're going up the Pacific coast of North America, you're going to make a right turn, okay, an eastward turn, or if you're coming south, it's going to be a left turn. And when you're looking for that big, huge passage of water that makes that eastward turn, and you come up hugging the coastline out of Monterey and all, Big Sur, Monterey and all that, and you come up to San Francisco Bay, that opens wide up, particularly if you're in a ship the size they were in and going the speed they were going. You're not going to miss how that opens up. Now, if you're looking for that eastward turn, you're going to make that turn into the open mouth of the San Francisco Bay. So that you get the point. The point is that there's no way Cabrillo missed San Francisco Bay. Now, especially when you learn, as you dig into the logs of the expedition, you learn that Cabrillo's ship, the flagship, the San Salvador, it was, and I'm putting air quotes on this word, it was separated, lost from the other two ships in the expedition because of weather, we are told. And
I remember this. Yeah,
they're separated for I think 3 or 4 days, right?
Right.
Well, plenty of time for Cabrillo to slip into San Francisco Bay with the flagship, do kind of a recon, sail around the whole bay, right, and then come back out. And then, coming down.
Who is generally attributed with discovering San Francisco Bay? Was it Drake?
Well, no, Drake was popularly credited with it for a while, but there's some controversy. I think Drake also, by the way, did the same thing Cabrillo did. I don't think Drake obviously didn't miss San Francisco Bay, and I think he found and reconned the real San Francisco Bay. But Drake was on. He's excellent subject for a book. But his expedition was there were parts of it that remained classified, get this, for 400 years. He was angry at Queen Elizabeth in his lifetime for not letting him speak about having gone around Alaska up into Arctic waters. We are told that in academia and school books, we're told that, he went up to, probably Oregon, Washington, something like that, and then made a left turn and headed, back southward to Japan. But actually what he did, there's a book by Samuel Balfe called The Secret Voyage of Sir Francis Drake, and it talks about how the facts were declassified. There were certain things declassified that came out in the 1990s that proved that Drake actually went all the way through, went around Alaska, what we call Alaska today, of course, into Arctic waters, looking for the Northwest Passage. But Queen Elizabeth would not let that be publicized at the time. So I think Drake certainly did go into the, and I say that in Secret Missions 5, but I believe officially it might be Vizcaino. Vizcaino was the Spanish explorer explorer for Spain, who did the essentially copied. No, I'm sorry. I apologize about that. I talk about that in this book. Believe it or not, Vizcaino also allegedly misses San Francisco Bay. So we're told this BS story about all these guys missing it. So off the top of my head, I can't recall who was actually credited with it, but Vizcaino's the guy who followed Cabrillo's exact route and then changed all the names. Like San Diego was originally San Miguel,
Right.
and Vizcaino says, "Now I'm calling this San Diego."
So if we've got several people missing the San Francisco Bay Area, and then all of a sudden somebody is actually the person that takes credit for it or whatever, is there a lot of, well, I guess for lack of a better term, are there a lot of secret missions being done by these guys under the flags of these different countries?
I think, oh yeah, there's a lot of activity that part of the expeditions remain classified in these cases. And this all has to do with, in my opinion, gold. I go into, in Secret Missions 5, I go into the old books that there were ancient sources that, of course, were part of the material seized in the Fourth Crusade. But then there was literature that was written at the time of the Age of Exploration, wherein this information was embedded within fiction. And it is known that some of these guys had copies of these works. And I go into specifically what I think these guys were looking for in San Francisco Bay and why they all keyed in on San Francisco Bay. And it's because of primarily the search for gold that they were keeping the secret, right? They were trying to keep it as secret as possible. But it was something that's over in the East Bay area that has to do with when you're starting to get over towards like where Berkeley is and all that. And it's a geophysical thing, I think, that they were first looking for before the land expeditions. Remember, these guys were just doing recons by boat.
I think a lot of people don't think of the conquistadors as being parts of secret societies, but they definitely had secret societies, and they may have, had some of this information from those.
Well, I exactly, and I go into that from the very first volume of the Cabrillo book. I talk about the Hidalgo culture. Now, the Hidalgo culture, these were, basically most people, it's like, oh, well, those are noblemen and the upper crust class. But specifically to be Hidalgo, you had to either yourself have been knighted or be the descendant of a knight. Now, if you were the descendant of a Templar, okay, they would call you, or this is where the term originally came from, they would call you Hidalgo de Sangre, knight by blood. And the reason they came up with that was because this was the era when the Templars had been disbanded and they weren't supposed to be together anymore, right? And for a while,
right,
it was illegal to display their famous red cross, the cross Pataki, their specific cross symbol.
But in Portugal, they just changed their name.
Exactly, to the Order of Christ. So if you were called Hidalgo, that was one thing. But if you were known to be Hidalgo de Sangre, you were considered and known to be, by record and blood, a descendant of a Templar knight. And a lot of these guys were Juan Cabrillo, Hidalgo de Sangre, and so therefore, and I lay this out, I go into the detail in Secret Missions 5 a little bit more than I did in the Cabrillo book. Yes, exactly. These guys would have had access to these ancient charts and documents and manuscripts that had been seized during that crusade and kept by the Templars and passed down. Christopher Columbus, was himself Hidalgo de Sangre, it appears.
Where are you getting this whole idea that Columbus explored in 1485? Where does that come from? Seems that I've heard this before.
Yeah, it's in It's in all the recent scholarship because a particular map, gosh, and I apologize, I can't remember the name of that map, but there was a particular map of Columbus's and a book of Columbus's that they've been authenticated, and the scholarship into that map and those books has led some scholars looking into this to suspect that in 1485, when he had taken an expedition in 1485, gone on an expedition, they know that for a fact. Conventional wisdom was that he didn't go as far as he probably did, which now they understand in light of this recent map that I'm talking about. And so it's still not settled. So, you can't say for sure. I think he did, based on the scholarship that I have seen. To me, it seems logical and rational. Before you go putting on the dog and pony show expedition, why not go check it out with one boat, a smaller crew, and just to be sure you're right. Yeah, kind of my opinion on Apollo 11. Not to go off on that, and I don't want to go off on that, but I have the same opinion of Apollo 11. To me, the big secret, isn't that we didn't go, which is stupid, or this, that, and the other. I think the big secret is that we actually did it before Apollo 11 to make sure we could do it before putting on the dog and pony show. I think
this is kind of more the secret space program kind of stuff.
Yes and no. I mean, that's kind of a connected thing. But yeah, I think Columbus had done it in 1485. The theory is that he didn't make landfall. The theory is that he went far enough to see the land and confirm that the land was there. That the first one that he made landfall on was indeed the 1492 expedition. But in 1485, it is now suspected by many that he at least had a land sighting of the Americas.
So about Richard Francis Burton, have you read or looked at Graham Hancock's idea about the America before that book? I read a little bit of, probably about half of that book, and it makes a pretty compelling case that there was this kind of like ancient civilization there in the Amazon at one time. And this is exactly what Burton and what later Fawcett are looking for.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, as you know, in my Burton book, I point out with the facts and the documents and stuff to back it up, Fawcett's search for Z was, dependent upon what Burton had done. Fawcett, in one of his own journals, says that he talks about manuscript 512, which the first English translation was done by Burton's wife. I think Burton had a hand in the translation, but it was done by Burton's wife, just like Burton goes to South America to begin with. And Fawcett
was translated from Portuguese by, I think it was written by a Franciscan or something.
Well, no, it was written by the commander of an expedition that had been exploring the area and was one of the people that found this city, and came back, wrote up the report, and it sat in the archives in Rio de Janeiro for, it was 1753 when he wrote it. And it was in the Portuguese archives until it was 1865 or 6, I think, when Isabel Burton did the first English translation. So it was kind of an unknown document, except to certain people like Burton and such. But Fawcett, his whole thing was, I think if we can pinpoint what Burton was actually doing, and if I'm right, if he was in the areas that I think he was in, I think basically Fawcett was following up on what he had learned through British intelligence that Burton had found. Now, whether Burton went to Fawcett's actual same lost city of Z, I think he found one of the cities, and it was definitely the same lost civilization. I think Burton, and I agree with this, in 1860, Burton came to the United States, and he very specifically, after touring back east, he very specifically went to Salt Lake and spent a few weeks and was given some information. And I personally think that Burton thought that the section in the Book of Mormon talking about their kind of lost civilization, the cities that when they came over from Israel or wherever it was they came from, actually, when they came here and established their civilization long ago, I think Burton suspected that these ancient ruins, going so far back, that there was some truth to that. I don't think he bought Joseph Smith's religious part of all that for 1 minute. Burton was a smart guy on that stuff, but I think he thought there was something to this stuff that Smith was told that he read in these golden plates. And so he goes to Utah, and then a few years later, he gets himself assigned to South America. And when you look at his writings and such, and when he disappeared, he was all over this area where Fawcett says the city of Z was. Now, I'm not the first guy to say this, but I agree with it. I talk about it in the Burton book. One of the cities mentioned in the Book of Mormon that these ancient, Mormons who came over from the Middle East established in South America was called Zarahemla. Well, hello, everybody wonders, Fawcett and his lost city of Z, what did the Z stand for? He never identified it. Well, I think what Fawcett was looking for was Zarahemla, the ancient so-called Mormon city of Zarahemla. Yeah, I think that's what Burton was looking for too.
Did he ever identify as a Mormon?
Not that I'm aware of. Who, okay. Burton or Fawcett? Neither one that I'm aware of.
But he was in Salt Lake City, so he probably had some contacts or was influenced somehow. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, he wanted to go there because by that time Burton was well known. And what's the guy's name? Brigham Young. I'm sorry, yes. Brigham Young. He had been a frontiersman. So it's interesting when Burton arrived and they had their private meeting, their first meeting, Brigham Young had maps of Africa and was able to, show Burton, he traced all of Burton's expeditions. He talked about, he goes, yes. And then you went here and you went there. And he was a huge fan of Burton. And wow. They had a lot in common. Young was not one of those prudish, churchianity kind of guys by any means. He was a very practical, down-to-earth guy, and it's very interesting. They spent some time being able to talk by themselves, and so they got along really well. They hit it off, and
yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, what's born out of something like that is you could see Young saying, hey, let me show you what we got in our vault here about these ancient cities or what we think about them or whatever. So I totally think Burton went to Utah to pick their brains about this ancient city stuff.
Right, because Joseph Smith was probably tapping into, he obviously was tapping into a lot of things that had, ideas that had already existed. And then people were, coming to him and bringing him artifacts all the time. Sure. And then there developed that competing view of whether the Book of Mormon events took place in the Midwest up here or down in the Yucatan and South America. So it started kind of moving towards South America for a while. So you had a lot of Mormon activities, archaeology, in a cooperation with a lot of the Mexican government and other South American governments too.
Absolutely. And that's, you're right. That's what they were looking for themselves.
And now you have that huge Mormon presence in northern New Mexico now too.
That's a result of this, this research and their organizations, their church's archaeology. And of course, Burton, being a foremost expert on this stuff in his lifetime, of course he's going to know, what he's going to have heard, through the grapevine and through publications and such, what they believe and what they think was there and what they were looking for. So I think that's why the main and only reason why he really went to Utah was for this.
Did not expect the Mormon connection to come up. It always does. It always does.
Well, and a lot of times you bring it up and people, they snicker, they go, "Oh, come on, you don't believe that." It's like this. I don't. All the religious part of Joseph Smith's shtick, his thing, that doesn't interest me. Okay, and his version of the story where the angel came to him and took him to the golden blades, I don't know about that either. Okay. What I think is there is a nugget of truth buried in the stuff relative to the ancient part of the story. When you're talking about they came over in their big round wooden ball shaped ships and they came to the Americas and they established a civilization. I think what you said hits the nail on the head. I think there was this ancient lost civilization. I think people were finding artifacts. And I think at some point Smith was exposed to these artifacts and maybe an old document or something. Okay. And then of course he built his Mormon thing, his version of it, on that. But the nugget of fact, I think, is to be found in the parts of the book where certain things where it talks about the lost civilization. That's what interests me. And that's where I think that nugget of truth is in that.
And then depending how you look at it, Mormonism came under pretty heavy influence from Freemasonry later, or certain Freemasons were vice versa influenced by Mormonism. So there was something to that too, like a bringing together of some of those similar ideas.
Yeah, Smith was a big fan of Freemasonry, obviously. And, he certainly would have incorporated any Masonic ideas about, lost ancient history into his thing and his interests. Yeah,
that makes sense. Plus his career as a treasure hunter.
Mm-hmm.
I think,
and a seer, so to speak. Remember, he would dabble with the seer stones, where he'd put them in that hat and put his face in the hat and claim that he would, saw stuff, and then he made that device where you wore it on your chest, and it had the goggles connected to it. Just all sorts of fun stuff.
Folk magic, yeah.
Exactly.
Walter, you mentioned something when you were talking about the Napoleon book. And it's interesting that you mentioned this because you mentioned the Louisiana Purchase and looking into that. And whenever I think you had posted that the next, what the next Secret Missions book was going to be for part 4, I had actually, I think on your Facebook, on that Facebook post, I said, "What are you going to do, Meriwether Lewis?" I thought that's what you were going to do, but is there any tie-in to that with the Louisiana, what you were looking at for the Louisiana Purchase before Napoleon?
Well, I am definitely, I'm definitely a fan of the idea that, well, not that it's a good thing, but I agree with the idea that he was murdered and that there was some skullduggery galore going on with Meriwether Lewis. Definitely.
Yeah, that site is not too far from here.
Yeah, it's about 30 minutes away.
And I definitely think that, there's some true mystery there. And I think it does have to do with the expedition and, the purchase and the expedition. Now, I went into that a little bit in the first volume of the Esoteric Napoleon book. I get into the question of the banker Nicholas Biddle, who Biddle was hired to write the book from the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition.
Yeah, he was the one that was later involved in Jackson trying to close the bank.
Exactly, the
Is that
whole central
correct?
bank
Right.
thing, and there was some real controversy there, and it looks like Biddle was just on the side of the central bankers, and I suspect, I haven't fleshed it out totally, but I go into it a little bit in the first volume that's already done and published of Esoteric Napoleon. I go into maybe what were some of his motives, what were they trying to hide. Did he take on this job of writing the book from the journals so that he could pick and choose what would be reported publicly in those journals, so that some things could be hidden? And this ties into, as I'm talking about in Secret Missions 5, I go into this a little bit. It goes into the whole alchemy of money, so to speak. Which is an interesting subject that has to do with the control of resources throughout history and such. And I suspect that Biddle was one of these guys. And it's possible that one of the possible reasons that Lewis could have been murdered was this banking and money alchemy skullduggery, to use that word again. It could also have had to do with finding real serious evidence of the lost civilization and somebody not wanting that to get out. So I don't try to solve the Meriwether Lewis mystery, because that's a series of books in itself, I think. Right. But I do go into it and address it more in the Esoteric Napoleon Volume 2.
Can you tease that idea of the alchemy of money a little bit?
Yeah, it has to do with, and if you're familiar with Joseph Farrell, this is more of his bailiwick. I touch on it in my stuff just to show you how the players, what their motives were and their connections. But it has to do with why this is an interesting thing that Joseph points out really well in a couple of his books, how the West valued gold, the East valued silver, and how this was a contrived thing, how the guys who really controlled money agreed that, okay, this half of the world, you guys are going to value everything on silver, and that's what you're really going to, look for with your mining and stuff. And the Western hemisphere, whatever, for lack of a better term, it's going to be gold. And what they did was they came up with a system to balance these off each other, to work these off each other, to keep the values of each silver and gold, respectively, high in their respective parts of the world. So they manipulated the values through this gold and silver system, but also it gets into the literal alchemy of actually manufacturing gold, okay, from the materials of the earth. But that led to, this is hypothetical, of course, that leads to an understanding of geophysical terrain, so that you could look at a mountain range, for example, you could read that terrain and you can identify, oh, there's going to be gold there and there and there. Now, Sechery, in his book, no longer in print, which I published years ago, he argues that the California gold rush was a completely contrived, the gold strike of 1849 was a completely contrived event, that they had known where this gold was long before that. And when it was decided that the United States wanted California, the California territory, that's why the gold strike, suddenly happens, so that they could have this big influx of population, because it was invasion by population, essentially. And but going back to what the alchemy of money, the alchemy of the gold is all about, they knew that gold would be found, in Sutter's field or something, mill or whatever it is.
Yeah, Sutter's Mill.
Yeah, because there was the Sutter Range, which is interesting. I talk about that in the book and such. But this would have been one of the things that I think they were looking for, these explorers were looking for when they went into San Francisco Bay, and they had reason to suspect where to look. And that was one of the things that was in either the ancient documents seized in the Fourth Crusade, and then, or embedded in literature of the day. And I go into that in detail, but it has to do with, to answer your question, to flesh that out, it has to do with controlling values, okay, but also knowing how to make the gold, but knowing how to read the terrain to see where you're going to have the gold strikes. And of course, that's a very valuable bit of knowledge to have there. So that's why it would have been kept clandestine.
I guess with Farrell that there is a certain amount of looking at the Venetian nobility,
yes,
that's involved, and kind of like this hidden history of money.
Yes,
but like also there too, Walter. I mean, there's all these connections in your work to all the like Telluric current, and then to the airship mystery and Del Shao. So that's all kind of going on at the same time. You mentioned 1849 is the gold rush. What was it? Del Shao? Is that sometime in the 1850s? And he claims that they're working on these airships. And
so is this about like a secret sources of wealth?
Yeah, because of this knowledge. And it all comes back to this particular secret knowledge that has to do with being able to reading the terrain. And yes, Sechery goes into this in the handprint of Atlas, how the so-called world grid, the telluric energy grid of the planet, plays into all of this. And if you know where these lines are, okay, and if you're aware of the world grid, you can use that to lead you to these places where the gold is. I talk about that in volume 5 as well of the series, because the Sutter's Mill area, okay, and the Sutter Range, all of that is in kind of almost tight into the angle of 2 intersecting world grid telluric currency lines, major lines, okay? So, and that's no surprise to anyone who looks into this stuff and looks at it. So if they in any way understood how to read the terrain and identify where these telluric currents were, then they could more easily find the spots where the gold's going to be found.
And then that wealth allows the development of these kind of breakaway civilizations. In
the breakaway thing, but even with any society, with any civilization, that's why there was I go through and give the basic hypothesis of the real struggle for control of California. It starts with the Templars, then between the Templars and the Catholic Church, and then here comes the United States. See, from the perspective, when you look at it as a Templar versus the Catholic Church thing, the history of California kind of comes into even more focus. Now, we know that the first Europeans to so-called, colonize, so they let it sit for 200 years and apparently didn't do anything in that respect. But, Spain had California for a while, right? And then, of course, when they give all that up, Mexico takes California, takes control of California, and then of course the United States after that. Now people usually look at the history of California as, oh, okay, so it was these 3 different nations, these political reasons that California passed from one hand to the other. Well, no, what you had was it was then, and it always has been, Templars versus the Catholic Church. How so? You go back to the idea that the Templars came here to the Americas before Columbus, okay, and if they had 150 or 200 years to explore, well, they certainly could have made it to California. So let's say you had Templars who either made it to California or had the information, the ancient information that was left behind by those who had made it to California. Okay, so you had a Templar interest in that. Now you have these explorers like Juan Cabrillo who are in secret, they're Templars. Okay, so armed with the Templar information, in the employ of Spain, and I think that the Templars gave the New World discovery to Spain kind of as a gift. I go into that, what I mean by that, because I think they thought it would be in their interest if Spain, they didn't want France because France had betrayed them, remember. I think the Templars thought that Spain would kind of have their interests in mind. So, but what happens is, and I'm giving you a little bit about the new book here, a little teaser, a little tidbit. Queen Isabella goes off and surprises them by telling the Pope that he can be in on this. So you got the Catholic Church rubbing their hands together going, aha, we can get this piece of the New World. And that, of course, would include California. And so you have Spain exploring, California via this expedition led by a Templar. You have a Templar looking for certain things in the Templars, but unfortunately, the church has to tag along. I see these priests, the Vatican representatives, or the priests that were on these ships and expeditions. I see them as similar to the political officers that the Soviet Union would put on every military vessel and military base over there.
They just wanted to save all those native souls,
Yeah, right. And
they were like the political commissars.
Yeah, exactly. So they are there in the mix, and then what happens is the Jesuits get into the mix, and kind of this wrests. They make a move, and I go into this in detail in the book, but they make a move that wrests control of California away from the Templars, in my opinion. And then the Templars end up turning around and doing kind of pulling it back in, because with the United States taking California. Now, what did Spain and Mexico have in common that puts them on the same side? Catholic nations. So it's not that, one country gave it to another country, Spain to Mexico. No. You can't look at it that way. Those are both Catholic nations. So it was in church control during Spain and Mexico's tenure, really. Okay. But the the Templars come along, and they're behind the United States getting control of California through Freemasonry, because, as we know, the Templar influence in the creation of Freemasonry, right? And the United States, it's been argued by, many people, is the first Freemason nation, the first nation founded by Freemasons, and that's essentially Templars. So Freemasonry, backing the United States, they come in and get control of California to make it a state and such. And of course, they use a guy who's kind of an asshole. That's John Fremont. And but they do it. And then I see where the church found a way through politics to get control of California again, essential control. And again, I go into the details of this in the new book. So and this all goes back to information that was seized from that Fourth Crusade.
Because they're looking for something that is in California that is precious to them.
No, they're looking for something in the geophysical terrain, and possibly remnants of a lost civilization. Because you have the stories that California, that some of the coastal areas might have been the site of colonies of whatever this Lemuria civilization actually was. So that idea goes way back.
Okay, so that's a great segue to the next question I wanted to ask was, what are we dealing with when we're talking about, and we've probably talked about this before, but what are we dealing with when we're talking about like an ancient civilization? Because this is always kind of the fun stuff to speculate.
Yeah, I think that there's, going back to what I said about the Book of Mormon, in the parts of the Book of Mormon when it talks about the refugees that came over from Israel or Egypt, the Middle East, and landed in South America, the Americas, and I said I think there's a nugget of truth in there somewhere. I think the same thing about the Lemuria, the idea of Lemuria. I think there was a civilization lost to us since that will explain why we have these existing legends and ideas of Lemuria. And the same for Atlantis too. And I think these were different cultural, these were different cultures that were at the same level of civilization, technologically speaking. And I don't have a problem at all with the idea, particularly if they were a seafaring civilization, that we're going to find, and that people are finding relics of, colonies, outlying colonies of this Pacific civilization, which we can call Lemurian, just for simplicity's sake. And that would have been part of this information captured during the Fourth Crusade.
Well, I'm usually pretty skeptical about a lot of this lost civilization, the Americas stuff. But I mean, whatever one thinks about the reality of it, you cannot ignore that so many of these historical figures have been like almost possessed by this idea, and that has shaped all these stories. It's shaped the country in the hemisphere, and it's created religions like Mormonism. I mean, whatever one thinks personally about it, it's still, you can't ignore how influential these ideas have been on creating this country.
Right. And you've got to, because this is so prevalent, right? And because so many of these figures and so many of these scholars have suspected this and interpreted things as being this way, or this being fact, you have to consider, okay, what if there's a nugget of truth to this? What if there is something baseline in there that is the truth, that kind of supports the basic idea? Maybe the details, the way these various scholars, have presented them, maybe those details aren't accurate. Of course, a lot of them are not going to be, but there might be that there is a foundation of truth to these ideas. And where would this thread have begun? Where would anyone have gotten the idea of this to begin with? Well, these maps, charts, and ancient manuscripts that had been stored in the Library of Alexandria that then went on to the Imperial Archives in Constantinople. That's where people would have found out about this, and it would have worked its way, down through the years.
Absolutely fascinating.
It is. It really, when you dig into this, it's kind of hard to put it down, so to speak. It's because it just makes so much practical sense when you take a look at the historical perspective of how people could have found this information, and the idea, for instance, when you talk about the Lemurian civilization, people get this idea that, you're talking about these anti-gravity flying machines and submarines and this kind of Hollywood or New Age fantasy version of the civilization. But David Childress has written a very interesting book titled The Lost World of the Calm. And yes, David has written about things like I just described, but in this particular book, he does an excellent bit of scholarship, and he presents the idea of this seagoing civilization. No, they don't have, electrogravitic submarines or flying saucers. No, nothing like that at all. They just simply had the resources and the means to sail the seas, and they just simply, figured out how to build seafaring vessels, and they understood navigation. And I don't think it's crazy to think that somebody in the ancient world had figured out longitude and latitude before, our modern world figured it out.
Right.
Longitude and latitude could very easily have been one of those lost technology things, I say with air quotes, that was seized in the Fourth Crusade, for example. So,
well, there's the Perry Reese map.
Exactly. The Perry Reese map being an example of, what we're talking about. It doesn't mean they had to have nuclear submarines and satellites in the skies to understand.
They rode dinosaurs.
Maybe, yeah.
Well, see, that's the thing, is that people think that there is...
I'm kidding about the dinosaur thing when I said maybe.
Maybe.
There's going to be somebody out there that says, Bosley said they rode dinosaurs.
Well, it's just yeah, right. There's that popular conception of quote unquote Atlantis that I think has just come down through, it's like some silly popular culture, or through, some cult group out there or something like that. But just like, I really think that what Plato was talking about, it was something that was like an amalgamation of all these different civilizations that had just kind of come and gone. It was almost just like this memory that just got jumbled together, and that, he could have been talking about Crete, but he also could have been talking about whatever happened in the Black Sea. There's evidence that there was a big flood there, and
I disagree with. I think the truth is somewhere between the popular conception or misconception of Atlantis and the dry conclusion that it was just Crete and a flood of the Mediterranean. I think the truth is somewhere between those two. Crete, and I'm not saying you're saying that this is the way it is, but you mentioned it, and whenever I see that, I'm like, oh gosh, the bean counting academics are at it again. They just can't handle anything that's not their dogmatic scripture. But certainly, there's a more realistic way to look at the idea of a lost ancient civilization, and when you look at it from a more practical point of view, I think it becomes more plausible for people who might otherwise doubt it when all they've seen is this fantasy idea.
Right. Well, I always say that the search for the mother civilization is really I think more than anything, it's a spiritual quest. And I really don't think I really don't think we should expect the academic establishment or the really young science of archaeology to necessarily, give us validation in that. A lot of people get really upset about it, but I think it's kind of a separate thing.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that there's definitely a spiritual element to the search for these things, but I also think that there were these civilizations. For example, you've heard the story in the 1908 Arizona newspaper about the alleged city in the Grand Canyon that was found in the cabins. How that's reported. Now, when going back to David Childress's book on the Calm, if you recall, in that article, the guy in the 1908 article was describing the best way he could describe it. He was describing it as Egyptian, but when you get the details, it's not quite Egyptian. Well, Childress points out that the Calm, they were a civilization that was an amalgamation of elements from East India, from what we call Thailand today, and there was a connection to Egypt, both a practical and a cultural one. So you mix those three cultures up into its own culture, and you get a group of explorers of the Calm who, let's say, establish an outpost in Arizona in the Grand Canyon, and might not their outpost, its design and architecture and interior decor, might that not look to a guy in 1908 like it could possibly be Egyptian? So, as Childress argues in this book, what if it's not an Egyptian, colony or city or whatever, necropolis that they found? What if it's actually this Kham culture, Cham, from which, by the way, comes the name of the country, Cambodia, and Vietnam was part of this civilization, and on and so forth. So, that's another way and I like this. I'm a real advocate of David's book, Lost World of the Con, because I think it does a great service to the argument of the Lost Pacific, for the Lost Pacific culture, civilization, because it does take this practical approach, and this more showing how this fits in with the ancient ancestors of our current Indonesian cultures, for example. So for what that's worth.
So this brings me to something that I've been seeing a lot recently in the field of the, I guess, quote unquote, alternative, I guess, speculative community, and that's Tataria.
Yes.
So I had not heard about this till a friend of ours actually asked us, "Have you heard of this Tataria thing?" And I was like, "No. What is Tataria?" And he explained it. And my immediate thought to me was like, it just seems like it's some kind of weird Russian propaganda tool.
Right.
And then there's another aspect of this whole Tataria thing where they bring in like pictures from World's Fairs and say that was part of Tataria.
Yeah.
When like you could easily go and find that online, and like here in Nashville there's a Parthenon, and I'm pretty sure it's not from Tataria.
Oh, they claim that it is, though. They claim that it
Right.
was, that we're being told a lie, that it's a big cover up, and it's. I mean, I personally looked up the county records from the time that was built, and showed a Tataria guy, okay, here's the county record, here it is, here's a photocopy of it, here's the details of when that was built and why. And basically the response is, nah, it's essentially it's a conspiracy to. So what they do is they present something that on the face of it proves to be, you can prove that it's not true. And what they do is they fall back on, oh, no, it is true, but it's a conspiracy. All those documents, those county records and stuff, those were all contrived. Those were, they either lied on them or they've been faked. And so you can never disprove what they're saying. Yeah.
That is quite the organized conspiracy. That would take a lot.
Well, that leads to that
Davidson County was in on it the whole time.
Exactly. And when you point this out, when I hear we're getting a good chuckle over it because it is laughable, some people, they get offended. They say, well, how can you talk about the things you talk about and advocate what you advocate and not advocate this and agree with this? And what this is the generation, the first generations that grew up with this everybody gets a participation trophy philosophy. They finally came of age and they're finally adults and stuff. And
they went to YouTube University.
They went to YouTube University on top of that. But what it is that they latch on to something. They advocate a particular idea, hypothesis, theory, and they don't think it's fair, with air quotes around that word, when other people use critical thinking and discernment and point out, hey, you're wrong there. This was built in such and such year for the such and such fair or whatever. They think that you're not playing along. You're supposed to give them their participation trophy. In other words, all theories, all hypotheses, no matter how ridiculous or no matter how easily disproven, they all have to be entertained. They all have to be respected. And you're not supposed to say anything, or God forbid you be critical or mock, any foolishness, because you're not giving them their participation trophy. And so what they've done is they've fallen back on, oh, it's a conspiracy then. If you disprove with documentation, then they tell you that documentation isn't accurate, it isn't true.
Yeah, you can't win. I mean, that seems to be kind of like the go-to explanation for all kind of conspiracy stuff these days anyway. I mean, QAnon is doing the same kind of stuff. I mean, as far as Tataria goes, though, because I really want to, I don't completely understand it. They're saying that there's this. I mean, I know what the Tatars were. I know who the Mongols were. They're saying that I guess there was this big inland Asian empire at one time, and that somehow, like, how exactly do the pictures of the World's Fairs tie into Tataria?
They were colonies, I think.
Yeah, it's so, and so, you want to ask them, okay, so what you're saying is these structures from this World's Fair were actually standing and existed when Columbus arrived. You're saying they existed, before that. So what happens with the people who, up until this World's Fair, were people in our modern era that were living in the area? What did they think about these buildings? Are they in on the conspiracy too? Did they agree never to talk about them?
The thing that's really interesting to me is, I think without knowing it, they're really picking up on something, and that is that time period, the late 19th century, was really magical. Yes. And it was, so
bingo.
It was so positive and such an optimistic outlook, post-Civil War, regeneration, that it seems alien. It seems so alien to us now.
Oh, and what you just described was the reason in my opinion, was the reason the 20th century happened the way it did.
Yeah.
Things were going so upward and forward that those who decide the direction civilization is going to go and the ups and downs decided we can't have this. This is my opinion, that the whole getting into the World War era, getting into the globalism, it was decided by they who decide these things. There you go. I'm throwing a bone to the conspiracy crowd. That no. We've got to break this optimism. We cannot allow this. This cannot be. And that's why I think it was greatly a reason why, not the only reason, but greatly a reason why the 20th century happened the way it did. If the 20th century, I want you to think about something. If the 20th century had happened the way the late 19th century was going, even with, whatever social issues had to be worked out or whatever, but you know what I'm talking about. If the 20th century had stayed on course with the way the late 19th century was headed, imagine the different century we would have had. Mm-hmm. In a good way, I mean.
Well, there's all kinds of counterfactual history, especially like with World War I, that if World War I had never happened, would it have been a better world? I mean, I've definitely heard that theory.
And I think this was a nefarious and just insidious reaction to the direction the 19th century was going.
Well, even just in the interest of, controlling wealth, and if people like Tesla were basically inventing free energy, I mean, that's the enemy of scarcity.
Yeah, God forbid, right?
Wealth hoarding, yeah.
And the optimism, God forbid that so many of the masses have optimism, because with optimism, what happens? Things like, oops, the American Revolution. And yes, I know there were players behind the American Revolution making that happen, but still, the American Revolution it's still the globalists, the controllers, the elites, they still felt the sting of that, because what happened as a result of that was, no matter what was going on the big political level behind the scenes, what did it result in? It resulted in the common people being confident and feeling like, hey, wait a minute, I don't have to listen to a king. I don't really have to, I can, be part of what the government says and does. And that was an offshoot that the elites did not like. That did not go according to their plan. And when Napoleon embraced that idea, Napoleon crowned himself emperor, There's interesting stuff behind that. And he conquered these countries that, by the way, were declaring war on him. You realize there were, I think, eight or nine Napoleonic Wars, and he only declared one. Why did they call them Napoleonic Wars? Anyway, I digress. But when he would establish his form of government in these conquered areas, it was much more based on the principles of what the United States have been based on. It was much better for the common people than the previous the monarchies had been for them, and that's really why they hated Napoleon and wanted to stop him, because he was giving the people a better world to live in, and they didn't want that. And this idea continued through the 19th century, even though they found a way to get rid of Napoleon. The idea still continued, and that's what you saw at the end of the 19th century, the ultimate result of the common people finally, for the first time in known history, really wielding confidence. And again, God forbid. So they decided, the money people, the elites, what have you, they decided that no, the 20th century, by God's going to go a different direction, and it's going to be the direction we say it. And we've got to break their confidence. And so then we spent from World War I up to 9/11, just one confidence breaking thing after another, like it was some type of psyop, as the conspiracy people love to bandy about. Everything's a psyop now. McDonald's changes its ketchup recipe; it's a psyop. I don't know about you guys, but I'm getting sick of hearing that. It's like, come on, guys. Not every single thing.
Well, didn't you used to run psyops, Walter? You part of that?
No, but there are tactics and things in psyops that come in handy when you're doing perception management stuff, or when you're doing asset handling.
Well, I think my point in saying that is that
trying to fool an enemy.
My point in saying that is that you understand what a real psyop looks like, as opposed to
the conspiracy scholars do too. There's some really good ones out there.
Absolutely.
But my thing is that I think in the last year, and the reasons are obvious, we know the reasons, but last year was the apex of just conspiracy land really going nutty with every little thing. The like you said before, the Q people, I remember last year when people were, and this was only like 2 weeks into the first COVID lockdown thing. Okay. 2 weeks. And people were already showing these videos of the military's taking over the cities. Here's the trains with all the tanks. And I remember looking at one and pointing out myself to these people, hey, wait a minute. That video is 3 years old from a unit at Camp Pendleton returning from the Middle East, and their equipment was taken from the ship, put on the train, and it's heading out of town, not into San Diego. But people were using that as this was just taken the other day, or today. And you point that out, it's like, people, you're going nuts.
Video taken completely out of context.
Exactly. And there were some people you just couldn't tell them otherwise. They'd get mad at you. And the Q people are that way. The angry response, or you're just an ignorant fool. You don't know what you're talking about. And all I can say is that Kool-Aid must taste really good.
Well, I don't know, Walter, if you're aware of Eric Davis. He's also there in California. We had him on.
Yeah.
We talked about how everybody kind of at a mass consciousness level in 2020 went into their own kind of chapel perilous, because all of a sudden you're stuck at home with nothing to do. You get on the internet, you go on YouTube, you go down the rabbit holes. And so like all of a sudden everything becomes much more popular as a conspiracy than it used to.
Yeah.
And I remember actually it was late March, early April, I was doing my own kind of like, just isolation thing. Surfiel sends me this thing on Twitter, this guy talking about how, this is it. The storm is coming, the QAnon storm and all this. And I was like, man, this is ridiculous. But but also the other thought that I had about it was like, you know what? I would rather it be the storm than it be the coronavirus.
Exactly.
I would rather it would be that the coronavirus is fake and this is actually what it's all about. They're getting the kids from underneath the chambers underneath New York City.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think that there's just got to be a distinction between something like what you do and the kind of like looking at things and doing a whole bunch of research.
Healthy speculation.
And
healthy speculation, yeah, and admitting when you're speculating, and the number one thing I try to do this, but the number one thing that a lot of people in this field need to do is start having the maturity to throw in there, hey, I could be wrong. But they won't do that because admitting that you could be wrong gets less clicks on your social media, gets less clicks on your podcast. You know what I mean? With a lot of these people, so they're not going to say they're wrong. I took, it was both and amusing early on in the lockdown when it was clear, with all these people, I mean, that clearly had they never spent a moment alone contemplating anything. It seemed like as soon as they got solitude and couldn't leave their houses, they were all going crazy.
The silence was deafening.
Yeah. Have you never just had a day where you stayed at home and read a book or thought about anything? Does every waking minute of your life have to be outside socializing, interacting? And I feel sorry for those people because to me, that's kind of feel sorry when I see adults behaving the way adults were behaving last year. It's aggravating because, you want to. It made me impatient. That's not the word, but it just, I was disgusted. I'm like, come on, get a grip.
And some of us kind of thrived. I mean, I felt like I really thrived last year.
Oh, me, of course, for 6 months of it, I was dealing with chemo. So I had kind of a pass to be able to lay on my butt and watch TV and read. But you get the idea. Even if I wasn't going through cancer treatment, I spend my life right now, things are open and I'm clear to the cancer stuff. But my life right now is pretty close to what it was during the lockdowns last year because, I spend a lot of time at home. That's where I do my, my scholarly part of my research. And so to me, it wasn't such a big shock. To people like us, I don't think it was such a big shock to have to deal with. But seeing those other people out there, the muggles, as they call them in Harry Potter, like the whole phenomena with the Karens. I mean, come on, people, get a grip on your behavior. That's embarrassing. These people that were freaking out and getting triggered.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a lot of precedents for, people just having to hold up for a little bit. I mean, people back in frontier times, I mean, you're just hanging out with maybe your nuclear family, maybe just you. And, you pretty much chilled inside and that might be a few years,
Yeah. And hopefully somebody doesn't pick up an axe and wipe out the whole family, but
right.
Thank you, Rodney Dangerfield. That's a great line. That's always been one of my favorite routines. He was a quiet man. It's like one day he picks up an axe and wipes out the whole family. People say he was a quiet man, a real quiet man.
That is great. Yeah, I totally concur. And just the whole thing about when you're talking about like the elites and all this type of thing, it's like, I still believe that there is such a thing. It's just that all that has been just like, it's been conspiracy theory and all that stuff has been weaponized, but it doesn't mean that there's some truth to some of it.
Right. That there's not some truth to some of it. You mean, yeah. Right. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you on that. This is where, like, when people get upset at me when they see me criticizing and kind of with humor, kind of mocking certain things. Those are the things that I feel have crossed a line into the absurd and the ridiculous and need to be pointed out as such, so that, people can get back on track with rational thought. But I'm still with people on the idea. Yes, I think there's ETs that have visited and continue to visit this planet. That yes, there are conspiracies. My God, history's full of conspiracies. Yes, there are, lost civilizations, and I mean, come on, it's still a mystery about who built these megalithic structures. I mean, that's still kind of an amazing thing for being so old. But it doesn't mean that every idea that comes down the pike, is going to be right, is going to be accurate, or is even going to be reasonable. And you have to be able to say, now, wait a minute, some of this stuff, you've gone too far now. This extreme is a little bit nutty, and that's not likely. So let's kind of, if we're going to have a serious conversation about it, let's rein it in a little bit, to the more likely practical. And no, we don't have to treat any and all ideas and theories and hypotheses with the same respect, because some, quite frankly, like the thing we were talking about with Tartaria and, this World's Fair exhibit that we know when it was built, the idea that that's actually an ancient structure and there's a big conspiracy. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, you have to actually embrace the mystery and not have to have an answer.
There you go. Yeah, embracing the mystery, but here's the thing with that particular example. There's no mystery to the Parthenon in Nashville.
Right.
There's no mystery whatsoever. So let's quit making a mystery around it. Sometimes I think there's people that they want to manufacture something to talk about. They want to manufacture something that they'll consider their own thing. So they go out on this limb.
There's too many real mysteries for, that it's really, you're doing a disservice to yourself if you're just caught up in bullshit.
And then when they get upset, when guys like me, will just kind of be dismissive of the Tartaria discussion, it's because, well, every time I do take a look at it, it very quickly proves to be ridiculous and something that, there's nothing new that's convincing you guys have come up with. So, if you want to be taken seriously, I would say to them, let's start seeing some real scholarship. Let's quit, the stuff you're pointing to, doesn't have any legs.
Yeah, I can take you to the city archives here. We can look at the documents of the people who built it. I can take you to the pyramid grave of the man who envisioned it.
There you go. And if you say, oh, well, that's all a conspiracy, then it's like, I'm done talking with you.
Exactly.
The pyramid grave is part of Tartaria. That was one of the colonies of Tartaria.
This world we live in. But it is interesting how that seemed to, at least from my perspective, because I was still paying attention to stuff, that seemed to have taken a back seat. UFOs seem to have taken a lot of things seem to have taken a back seat last year to, because of all the COVID conspiracy talk and all the Q stuff going on. Obviously, it was all about the politics and the politics of the COVID issue.
I'm sure the UFOs of Tartaria will come back.
There you go.
This goes back to my original point, Walter. The Tartaria. Do you think that actually is some kind of Russian propaganda tool? Because the first time I heard about it, I was like, the Russians are really good at this.
Yeah.
And that's just what it seems like. It's
my understanding that an aspect of the Tartaria thing can be traced back to Russian propaganda. Excuse me. Let's correct this. Soviet propaganda.
Okay.
I like to make that distinction between the Soviet Union and Russia.
Yeah.
Okay, because the Russia of today has not been the Soviet Union for 30 years, and things that were done under the Soviet Union that were not done under Russia prior to that, and would not have been done, really need to be credited to all that Soviet crap, because that was part of the propaganda you're talking about, that it can be the Tartaria thing that can be traced back. That was a very specific Soviet thing. What was included in some of that was there were those who would say, oh, well, actually the Russians invented baseball even, they would say all sorts of, just to counter the West, just to counter their rivals, the United States.
We know it's a Freemasonic conspiracy because of the layout of the field.
Yeah, exactly. and because the guy who did it was a Mason, right? I think they know the lodge he was in and everything. Doubleday. Well,
wasn't he associated with Blavatsky, right? Wasn't that?
That sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that sounds familiar a little bit. So, it's kind of like the Hanabu saucer thing. Could be, Ernst Zundel. That's the name people need to look up, because that's where this whole Nazi flying saucer crap started. It was post-war, and it was propaganda, neo-Nazi propaganda, and
the Admiral Byrd stuff.
God, yeah, that too. What happens is this stuff gets out there, and it becomes so popular, and it's that old thing where if you say it enough times, it'll become true in people's minds, and it gets said enough to where people get excited over a particular idea, and they say, well, you know what, I don't care what anyone says against it. I want to believe this, so I'm going to believe it. And they're conspiring to keep it from being proven. They're conspiring to keep it down, and they're the ones who are saying this isn't true. And people get caught up in that kind of enthusiastic thinking, and that's where you get these reactions we're getting. And when you tie that into their emotional survival, it gets worse. Case in point, the Q people. I mean, we came up. We are in an intense political atmosphere in our nation's history these last several years, and so people are feeling scared. They don't know how to react to things. They don't know what's going to happen. They feel like they can't predict what's going to happen, so they latch on to things like, some people latch on to, where religion is concerned, and that's what they put their faith in, right? It's very basic, and had these people putting their faith in this Q character, and of course many of us knew it was BS, but you can't tell them, because their emotional survival is dependent upon, they're hanging on every word, and they really believe that the world is going to crumble, if they don't believe this, if they don't follow this. And you're not going to be able to tell them otherwise while they're in this frame of mind. And it's just where we're at now. Look at the crazy puritanical things that are being done with just over things people say, people joke about, or even just sharing a thought. There's certain, this sounds like a cliche, but I'm 57 years old, and I never thought I'd live to see the day in America when there's certain discussions you can't have in a public forum. Discussions, just merely talking about something without the cancel culture possibly coming after you. That is, my God, that is so Soviet. That is so red Chinese. That is so totalitarian. That it's insane, and that's where we're at now. That's where we're at.
Yeah, we've got to be careful that we don't go from one extreme to the other. I think that's almost like the story of America is trying to find that balance between the extreme left and the extreme right. That's where we are.
Yep, and the seas are rough right now, and the ship is listing, port to starboard, back and forth.
I think it's okay to point out if someone is saying something that is objectionable or could get people hurt or whatever, but at the same time, it can also go too far. We've got to be reasonable.
Yeah, we do, but there is this phenomenon out there that people are losing it. That whole thing about people being triggered.
Yeah, it's magnified by social media. It's just magnified by it. It's. I think the 24-hour news channels first magnified it, and then social media just magnified it even further.
In-person conversation is so much different.
Yes, it is.
When you have people who want to be on that IV drip 24/7, and they tell you you should be on it too. I know that there's a portion of my audience that I don't have. It's a small number. I'm not worried about it, but it's measurable. There's a portion of the audience that I used to have that, because I'm not talking every time I go on my live stream about the hot conspiracy topics of the day that everybody else is talking about ad nauseum, that's why they don't watch me anymore. Well, Bosley ain't talking about Q. Bosley ain't talking about COVID. Bosley ain't talking about all these other things that everybody else is talking about. Feral dark journalist, who coast to whatever, whoever. So I don't want to listen to him, because all I want to hear is constantly, every time, these same subjects. And if he's not talking about these subjects, well, he just doesn't know. He's not clued in. He's not one of us. He's not aware. Well, no, I'm aware, but I may not agree with the extent that it goes, and you can't live on that stuff all the time, or you're going to go crazy. And to varying degrees, I think a lot of these people are suffering, a form of little madness, little craziness. If they're constantly listening to this stuff, constantly on that feed, there's a certain madness that sets in. Maybe low level in most of them, thank God, but it is there.
All right, Walter, this has been an awesome discussion with you. I've really enjoyed it. You have several books out, and I want to point out that your books are not available on Amazon. And you can tell everybody where they can get. But you have still some that are available there on Kindle.
Yeah, there's a couple of titles on Kindle that I decided to keep there.
I guess Empire of the Wheel may still be on there.
No, it shouldn't be. All that should be there is Shimmering Light, Latitude 33, and maybe one of the novels, I think, is all that's there. Empire of the Wheel and Secret Missions. These are all the other books are print on demand at lulu.com. If you go to lulu.com, lulu.com, and in the search bar, put in Walter Bosley or Walter Bosley Author Spotlight, something like that, you'll get to the pages where the books that I have written, and also the books by other authors that I have published, because I've been a publisher now for 19 years, believe it or not. And I have published other authors over the years, and you can find everything that I've written and everything that I've published there at lulu.com. And they put out a really quality physical book. So if you've never tried print on demand, I recommend it. You got to wait a few days, but it's worth the wait.
Okay. Well, this has been excellent, Walter. Thank you so much for it's been nice spending time with you, giving us a little update. When does Secret Missions 5, when do you think it's going to drop?
Oh boy, I'm trying to do a really good job on it, and it ended up being a bigger monster than I thought, in a good way. So right now I'm saying the end of April.
Oh, okay. That's not too far away at all.
Yeah, we'll probably have you on pretty soon to talk about it.
Cool. I look forward to it, guys. I always enjoy talking with you.
Thank you. Same here. Stay in the line for us, Walter. We're going to close this section out. And guys, we'll be back with a special announcement about Strange Realities Conference on Conspirinormal.
Welcome back to Conspirinormal.
That's right. That was a nice little discussion with Walter Bosley there about just a grab bag of topics. I think that's the first time that I've had Walter on where we've not specifically spoken about a book.
Yeah.
And this time we did talk about just kind of a little review and what he's going to write about in the upcoming book. And But we just kind of got started on some other topics, including Tartaria. So that was a very interesting little interview with him. I was really happy to talk to him, and also to know that he's now a cancer survivor and he's okay. Because when I
Beat the big C.
Yeah, when I found that out last year, I was like, oh man, it's like 2020. The hits keep on coming. It's just like, can't lose Walter Bosley, because to me, man's a national treasure. I got the privilege of hanging out with him in San Bernardino about almost 3 years ago now, and that was probably hung out with him actually a couple of times. Once with Greg Bishop, went to Giant Rock out there in the desert, and then just hung out in San Bernardino. He took me around the San Bernardino Mall, took me showed me like where the events in Empire of the Wheel, the first book, actually occurred. Took me to the grave site there of what he believes is the sacrifice in Empire of the Wheel. So yeah, always enjoy talking to Walter Bosley. He's probably one of my favorite guests. We've done a bunch of interviews with him since I think 2014. I think was the first time I did an interview with him.
I think I've been on at least 3 or 4.
Yeah, I
But
think
now-
there's been at least 3 or 4.
And that's
you've
just
been
the
on,
last
too.
few years. So yeah.
Yeah, so we did all the Empire of the Wheel books. I've done all the we've done all the books, the Secret Missions books, Shimmering Light. There was also we also went back and did an interview about Latitude 33 with him. So I think there's at least 2 or 3 that you've been on now. So all right. Anything that you wanted to add about that? Any your impressions or whatever?
Well, looking forward to Secret Missions 5. We touched on a lot of interesting stuff that I'm pretty interested in, as far as the Mormons and lost civilizations and the secret societies of the conquistadors, some of which we might have a little snippet in the Patreon segment. And very interesting as usual.
So we want to make an announcement about Strange Realities. You guys have heard we are actually going to be doing Strange Realities here in Nashville on October 15th, 16th, and 17th. It is going to be a hybrid event, which means that we are going to have some presentations taking place there at SIR Nashville, and we are going to have some taking place at the people's homes as they present from their homes. So we're doing it kind of like a mix of 2019 and 2020.
Mm-hmm. And if you are there, you will be able to see those broadcasted as well. The people who are not going to be there physically will have a big screen up.
Yes. So we want to talk about the prices, and the prices for Strange Realities. If you come, and there are a limited number of tickets, now that may fluctuate. It just depends on how things go with COVID. It depends on how Nashville opens up, closes down, whatever. We're just watching the situation. Pretty hopeful, though, at this point with the vaccine being around. So if you're coming to Nashville, you want to come to all 3 days, that is $70. Okay. If you're coming to Nashville and you already here in Nashville and you want to come on either Friday, Saturday, and Sunday individual days, that is $25. A piece. So you actually get a $5 discount doing the all 3 days ticket. Now online only, which we probably think will probably be the most tickets that we sell, is going to be $30 for online. And guys, I'm not going to go over the lineup quite yet. We'll save that maybe for the next episode. That is being finalized as we speak of who we're going to actually get there. But just know it's a lot of people from last year, and also some guests. Everybody that is a part of Strange Realities has been a guest on this show. So we want to see you there. We see you in person or interact with you online. Either way. That's October 15th through the 17th. So join us at Strange Realities 2021. All right. If there's anything else, I think we'll go ahead and call it a show. I think that was a good one. Next week we're going to have Adam Gorightly on to talk about his Spy, Saucers, and Kooks book. So really looking forward to that. So, all right, guys. Join us next week on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.